Welcome to Part 8 of Knowledge Targeting, the documentary series from TI1 Voice. This episode is called Disinformation, Bogus Information, and the Weaponization of Doubt. It is about the second crime, the one committed after the first, using words and websites instead of vehicles and cameras. And because it is an episode about false claims, it must be unusually careful with its own. We will name our sources, and we will say plainly where the evidence stops. Eleanor White opens her chapter on bogus information with a warning wrapped inside a piece of history. Her words, attempts to discredit the victims of the MKUltra experiments, or the COINTELPRO harassment programs, show that criminals who depend on public ignorance do work to discredit victims. Both of those programs are documented. Both were confirmed on the record. And still, White argues, the people harmed by them were mocked long afterwards. Knowledge Targeting is a 50-part documentary series produced by TI1 Voice. It works through the literature of organized stalking and electronic harassment chapter by chapter, alongside the research library that the community has built. The aim is not to persuade you of a conclusion. It is to lay out what has been claimed, what has been documented, and the distance between those two things, so that a viewer can judge the material for themselves. This is Part 8 of 50. Part 7, the lived experience, gave the floor to first-person accounts of electronic harassment, what people say happened to them in their own words. This episode asks what happens to those accounts once they are spoken aloud. Part 9, the historical roots, then traces the documented line from COINTELPRO to contemporary organized stalking. Tonight sits between testimony and history, and it concerns the machinery that stands between them. Everything in this series rests on a public archive. TI1 Voice hosts an evidence library where targets file dated, structured records of what they experience, a knowledge base of several thousand referenced articles, and a community wall where people compare notes. You will find it at one.witisk.org. The declaration guide there is blunt about limits. Filing a record does not guarantee that anyone will believe you. There is also TITV, a round-the-clock live stream carrying this series and other community programming. You can watch it at meet.witisk.org, under Public, TITV. Every episode also has a written companion article, with the sources laid out so you can check them yourself rather than take a narrator's word. If a claim in this episode matters to you, read the article, then read the source behind it. A word on method. The spine of this episode is Eleanor White's chapter on bogus information. Around it we searched the TI1 Voice knowledge base by meaning rather than keyword, pulling passages that bear on each section. Retrieval is loose, so every passage was checked against its own source before it was used, and anything that did not belong to this chapter's subject was set aside rather than quietly repurposed. 3 rules govern this series, and they matter more here than anywhere. First, documented fact and contested claim are labeled separately, every time. Second, no private individual is named as a perpetrator or as a disinformation agent. Attribution stays at the level of pattern and method. Third, an unproven claim and a deliberately planted one are completely different statements, and we will never let the first quietly slide into the second. A note for targets watching. This episode turns its scrutiny inward as well as outward, and that can sting. It is not an accusation. It is an argument that precision protects you. And one concession made plainly, doubt is not always weaponized. Sometimes a skeptical question is ordinary, reasonable, and asked in good faith. A community that cannot tell honest doubt from hostile ridicule will exhaust itself fighting the wrong people. Here is the route. We begin with the prologue White calls the second crime. Then the 3-move playbook. Deny, ridicule, pathologize. Then 2 further mechanisms, the trivializing list and brand contamination through the monarch label. Then the tool White offers in return. A plain, repeatable test that any claim can be put through, including the community's own. And finally the question underneath all of it. Why does anyone bother weaponizing doubt at all? Section 1. The chapters before this one described a crime committed against individuals through coordinated, distributed harassment. White's chapter describes a second crime, laid on top of the first. It is fought with words, websites, and merchandise rather than vehicles, cameras, and noise. Its object is narrow and specific, to ensure that when a target describes what has been done to them, they are not believed by anyone with the power to act. Where does the second crime find its material? Partly, White argues, in the community itself. The previous chapter documented why targets, worn down by years of siege and desperate for validation, sometimes share things they have not verified. That behavior is understandable in origin and damaging in consequence, and it is exploitable by anyone who benefits from a discredited community. This chapter is about the exploiters and about the mechanisms that convert weakness into ammunition. White's reasoning is uncomfortably simple. A disbelieved victim is a safe victim. A ridiculed community is a community nobody has to answer to. On her reading, the discrediting is not a side effect of the original crime, it is a second, deliberate layer of it, a fallback defense that activates when the primary defense of secrecy starts to fail. That is her argument, and we should be clear it is an argument. Now the documented part. MKUltra was a Central Intelligence Agency mind control program. COINTELPRO was a Federal Bureau of Investigation campaign of harassment and disruption aimed at domestic political groups. Both were confirmed by the Senate's Church Committee, acknowledged on the record, and published under the Senate's own letterhead. This is not contested history. What White points at is what happened next, or rather what did not happen next to the people harmed. The record runs like this. COINTELPRO began in 1956 and ran in secret for 15 years. In 1971, a citizens group burgled a bureau field office and mailed the files to reporters. In 1975, the Church Committee investigated. In 1977, the Senate held hearings on MKUltra. Note the mechanism of exposure. Not institutional self-correction, but a break-in. The system did not catch itself, and that detail matters later. The knowledge base entry on disinformation makes a point worth holding on to. Disinformation has, in its words, a dual nature. It is both a tool of deception and a label used to dismiss inconvenient truths. That cuts both ways here. The word can describe a genuine planted falsehood. It can also be thrown at an inconvenient account to end the conversation. Which one is happening in any given case is a question of evidence. White identifies three distinct techniques and offers one defense. The first is the playbook we are about to open. Deny, ridicule, pathologize. The second is the trivializing list, where real reports are stacked beside absurd ones until the whole pile looks the same. The third is brand contamination through the monarch label. Against all three she sets a single plain standard, applied to critics and to the community's own claims alike. Section 2. The core of the discrediting machinery, White says, is a three-move sequence. She finds all three operating against MKUltra and COINTELPRO victims, and argues from 2 decades of watching the discourse that the same sequence runs against organized stalking claims now. Note carefully what the playbook does not require. It does not require the underlying claim to be false. It works on the claimant's exposure, not on the claim's truth. Deny is the cheapest move and the first. There is no organized stalking, said with total confidence, usually by someone who has not read the specific report in front of them. It costs the denier nothing. No investigation, no paperwork, no professional risk. It costs the target everything because the file closes before it opens. And then the loop seals itself. No confirmation exists, so the denial looks justified in hindsight. The canonical example is documented. For 15 years, the Bureau's director flatly denied that COINTELPRO existed. The denial was total, confident, institutionally authoritative, and it was a lie, revealed only by that break-in. By then, a generation of victims had been filed away as unreliable, and the filing survived the paper trail that disproved it. Denial sets the baseline. Next, what happens when denial alone stops working, and ridicule takes over? Denial holds only while the evidence stays thin. White argues that once testimony accumulates, once enough people in enough countries describe the same tactics, once the statistics from Chapter 5 begin to circulate, a flat denial starts to look professionally embarrassing. So the playbook turns. The second move does not argue with the claim at all. It simply makes the claim look foolish, and it hands the work of discrediting to everyone watching. Ridicule is stronger than denial for a structural reason. A denier takes a position. He asserts something, however groundlessly, and he can be proven wrong later on the record, as the Federal Bureau of Investigation's 15-year denial of COINTELPRO eventually was. Ridicule asserts nothing at all. It commits to no fact, risks no refutation, and leaves nothing behind that a later disclosure could contradict. There is no position to defend because none was ever taken. That difference is what makes ridicule cheap. A denial needs a denier who is willing to be quoted by name. Ridicule needs only an audience. The bystander who laughs has performed the discrediting for free, and has done it without examining a single document or reading a single report. He was not persuaded by argument that the claims are false. He was given permission to dismiss them without looking, and permission is far easier to grant than proof. The knowledge base entry on weaponized narrative describes the same effect in general terms. A narrative that fits an audience's existing habits of mind tends to get accepted without much scrutiny at all. White's contribution here is to point out how very little that costs the person deploying it. One joke in one room reaches every person in the room, and each of them carries it outward at no further expense to anybody. The knowledge base entry on disinformation makes a point this chapter has to take seriously, because it cuts both ways. If the word can be used to wave away inconvenient truths, it can also be misused by a community that would rather not examine its own weakest claims. Some claims in this discourse are false. Laughing at a false claim is not a conspiracy against anybody. It is what people ordinarily do. So consider an ordinary person meeting these reports for the very first time. Two questions arrive together. The first is intellectual. Are the claims supported by evidence I could go and check? The second is social. What happens to me if I am seen taking them seriously in front of colleagues? Both are answered at once, silently, and it is usually the second that settles the matter. That is not cowardice. It is how reputations work. The fear of being marked as someone who believes in tinfoil hat conspiracy theories is enough on its own to prevent serious engagement, whatever the evidence happens to say. That is White's claim about the mechanism, and it should be carried as a claim. It matches ordinary experience and it matches general findings in social psychology, but it has not been measured for this particular community. Here the evidence runs out. Set the two moves side by side and the economics become obvious. Denial makes a factual assertion, so it can be falsified, which is exactly what happened when the Church Committee published its findings and the paper trail appeared under the Senate's own name. Ridicule makes no assertion, so nothing about it can ever be shown to be wrong. Denial needs an institution willing to speak. Ridicule needs only a room already leaning. This is why evidence has so little purchase here. A target can answer with real figures. The Bureau of Justice Statistics finding that roughly 11% of stalking victims report 5 years or more, and the Statistics Canada data confirming that stalking by multiple perpetrators exists as a genuine minority pattern. Both were set out carefully in Chapter 5 of this series. Both are official government statistics. Neither of them stops the laughter. Because the laughter was never about the evidence in the first place. It was about position. I am the kind of person who knows what is real, and I am signaling it by laughing at people who do not. Evidence does not change social positioning. You can hand over the report, the citation, the page number, and watch the room shrug, because nothing you handed over answers the question actually being asked. What does move a norm is status. Someone respected takes the claims seriously, and suddenly it is safe for others to follow. The knowledge base records a small example in Project Bonfire, welcomed within the community as a rare piece of formal research that treated the reports as worth studying. TI1 Voice's own recognition addendum names 3 pillars it is aiming at. Those are internal projections, not promises anyone else has made. Denial and ridicule together still leave a problem. Some targets do not stop. They keep filing reports, keep documenting, keep speaking, long after the laughter should have silenced them. That persistence now needs an explanation of its own, and the playbook has one ready, the most durable move it owns. The subject quietly changes. It is no longer the evidence the target has gathered. It is the target's mind. There are 3 ordinary routes to that label, and only one of them involves a clinician. The first is rumor, he is not stable. The second is the clinical note, the psychiatric referral this series examined in Chapter 6. The third is simply ambient framing, the atmosphere that gathers around anyone who keeps making a claim that has already been officially denied. All 3 arrive at the same destination. Once the label attaches, a loop closes. A statement gets read as a symptom instead of evaluated as a report. The target objects, and the objection reads as lack of insight, which is genuinely a recognized clinical sign in several diagnostic frameworks. That is exactly why the loop is so hard to escape. This describes what happens when a framework is applied without care. It is not a charge against clinical medicine. Watch how elastic the framework becomes. A complaint is read as a symptom. A careful record of dates and times is read as preoccupation. A government report confirming that multi-perpetrator stalking exists is read as outside material being drawn into the picture. The evidence gathering itself gets absorbed as part of the condition. That is White's account of a failure mode. It is not a claim that clinicians routinely behave this way. There are 2 versions of this move, and they differ only in their machinery. The institutional version needs a clinician, an appointment, and a diagnosis written into a file. The social version needs only a rumor that travels far enough. One is slow, documented, and appealable in principle. The other leaves no paper behind at all. Both end in the same place. The person is no longer heard as a witness. Now the concession this chapter owes its critics. Much doubt is ordinary and entirely reasonable. The knowledge base entry on the 1000-event memory log says so plainly. Critics warn that such logs can reinforce confirmation bias, and the logs carry no recognized evidentiary value in a courtroom. That is fair criticism, and it engages the content. The playbook never engages the content. That difference is the one worth learning to see. Set the 3 moves in sequence and the design shows. Denial establishes the baseline. Ridicule raises the cost of challenging it. Pathologizing explains why anyone challenges it anyway. The order is not fixed, and whether any particular instance is coordinated or simply emergent is not established. The chapter itself says intentional or emergent. What is consistent is the logic. Every move works on the claimant's credibility, and none of them touches the claim. And the asymmetry between the 2 sides is severe. Deploying the playbook costs a closed file, a joke, a whispered word, minutes of anyone's day. Defending against it costs years. A counter-narrative built up from nothing, evidence gathered and formatted and presented, composure held under conditions designed to erode it. All of it without institutional support, because the institutions that would normally provide that support are the ones the playbook runs through. So the first defense is recognition. This is a script. It predates your case. It was run against people making other inconvenient claims long before you, and knowing that blunts some of the damage it was built to inflict. The chapter's harder demand comes next. A community that knows the playbook is hunting for ammunition can stop supplying it, and that begins with something as small as the order of a list. A community that knows the playbook is watching for ammunition is better placed to stop supplying it. So White turns to a second discrediting mechanism, smaller and more specific than denial, ridicule, and pathologizing. It is almost administrative. It does not argue that a claim is false. It never touches the evidence. It works entirely through the manipulation of presentation order, through what a stranger reads first when the page loads. Call it the list trick. Notice the word doing the heavy lifting in that sentence. Peer. White does not claim to know who built those pages or why. She reports how they look to her and she leaves it there. That distinction matters more in this chapter than in any other, because a chapter about false information has to be scrupulous about its own. Suspicion is not a finding. Hold that thought. We will come back to it. Think about it mechanically. Someone arrives at a page about organized stalking. Maybe they searched for it. Maybe a link brought them. They know nothing about the subject. They start at the top, as readers do, and the first entries they meet become their working model of what all this is about. That model forms before they have scrolled a single line. Everything after is read through it. Psychologists call that anchoring. Two shapes of failure. If the opening entries sound trivial, if they say people leave their lights on to bother you, the model settles there. This is a subject about light bulbs. If the opening entries are unprovable, the claim that aircraft follow a target to watch them, the model settles somewhere worse. This is a subject where nothing can be checked. The knowledge base describes this as an abnormally low threshold for accepting a belief. And what is further down the page? Usually the strongest material the field has. Workplace mobbing, with decades of peer-reviewed literature behind it, much of it descending from the work of Heinz Lehmann. The consistency of street theater and noise campaign testimony across borders, from people who never met. Bureau of Justice statistics figures confirming a minority of stalking victims who report multiple perpetrators. None of that gets reached. The reader had already decided. Laid out in sequence, it looks almost harmless. A visitor arrives. They read the top item. A model forms. They scroll down and meet the documented material. And that material is not read fresh. It is read through the model that already exists. Consistent information slides in easily. Inconsistent information takes extra effort and gets discounted or quietly reshaped to fit. The order of those 5 steps is the entire attack surface. Here is the part that makes this tactic so slippery. Nothing on the page has to be fabricated. Brighting is real. Some targets experience it. Air stalking is genuinely reported, even though White regards it as unprovable. Real minor tactics and real contested tactics simply get promoted above better attested ones. Nobody has to manufacture evidence. Somebody only has to choose an order. That is why it is cheap to do and nearly impossible to prove. So who ordered those lists that way? Nobody knows, and this series will not pretend otherwise. The knowledge base article on plausible deniability makes the reason plain. Disinformation only works while the source stays hidden, and once the source is exposed, the campaign loses its power. Which means a badly ordered page and a deliberately ordered page look identical from outside. We can describe the mechanism precisely. We cannot name a hand behind it. There are 2 honest readings. 1. Someone built these pages to make the subject look silly. That is the community's suspicion, and White's, and it is not established. 2. Enthusiastic volunteers listed things in the order they thought of them, with no thought for a stranger's eye. Careless is at least as likely as hostile. And here is the useful part. The repair is the same under either reading, so the argument about motive can wait. White's first example is brighting. Leaving lights on shining lights at someone, using illumination to harass. She does not dispute that it happens. Some targets live with it, but set it beside sustained noise campaigns that destroy sleep, beside workplace mobbing that ends careers, beside the isolation described in the previous episode, and it is small. Give it top billing and a stranger concludes the whole movement is about porch lights. The second example needs care, so let us take it in order. What is claimed? That aircraft, planes, helicopters, drones follow a target, watch them, harass them from the air. What the evidence shows. White herself calls the claim, in her own words, totally unprovable. An ordinary person cannot obtain flight records, cannot identify a specific aircraft, and cannot tell a plane that happens to be overhead from one that is there for them. Put those side by side on one page at equal rank and something corrosive happens. A skeptical reader concludes that whoever compiled the list cannot tell the provable from the unprovable, and therefore that nothing on it can be trusted. The knowledge base article on the firehose of falsehood describes the same end state. Audiences give up and decide every source is equally unreliable. The documented items are not refuted. They are taxed by their neighbors. This episode should say plainly that the skeptic in that example is not doing anything wrong. Doubt is not always a weapon. Sometimes it is ordinary, and sometimes the community has earned it. The knowledge base article on disinformation notes the same double edge. The word is used both to deceive and to dismiss inconvenient truths. A movement that wants to be believed has to tell those two apart, starting with its own material. White's remedy is not deletion. It is labeling. If a claim with no current path to verification appears on a public page at all, it should be marked as reported but currently unverified, rather than sitting level with documented tactics. There are working models of this. The One Voice Declaration Guide, in the knowledge base, prints a blunt list headed "What this declaration does not do." It does not start an investigation. It does not guarantee belief. 6 labels would carry most of the work. Documented. Consistent testimony. Minor but real. Mechanism contested. Currently unverifiable. And a 6th that stings. No evidentiary standing. The knowledge base entry on the 1000-event memory log concedes exactly that. Such logs are not recognized as evidence in court, whatever their value to the person keeping one. Writing that down yourself before a critic writes it for you is how a resource earns trust. None of this would work if human judgment were tidy. It is not. First impression bias, the tendency of information met early to shape everything judged afterwards, is among the most heavily replicated findings in the psychology of judgment and decision-making. Once an initial impression is set, the mind stops evaluating and starts sorting. Material that fits goes in easily. Material that does not costs effort, and is often discounted or bent to fit. Follow one reader down one page. The top says brighting and air stalking, so the impression forms fringe material. Further down comes workplace mobbing, with decades of peer-reviewed research behind it, named institutions, named investigators. But it does not arrive as that. It arrives as another fringe claim, probably exaggerated like the ones above it. The credible material inherits the reputation of the weakest thing on the page, through nothing but position. So what should lead instead? Something a stranger can check in a minute. 11%. That is the share of stalking victims in the Bureau of Justice Statistics survey who reported being stalked for 5 years or more. It is a United States Department of Justice publication, with a survey method anyone can replicate and a citation anyone can look up. A reader meeting that first forms a very different impression. The countermeasure is simple to state, hard to practice. Put the mobbing literature at the top. Put the Bureau of Justice Statistics figures at the top. Put the consistency of street theater and noise campaign testimony across borders at the top, labeled honestly as consistent testimony rather than proven mechanism, but at the top. Let the harder claims sit further down, clearly marked. Let the first impression be the strongest thing the field has. Why does the order of a web page matter this much? Because credibility is shared. The knowledge-based study on official recognition argues that three audiences must be won before justice is possible: law enforcement, legislatures, and the medical and scientific community. Each of them meets this subject through a page like the one just described, which raises the obvious question: how should the full menu of claims be sorted? That is next. That standard is easy to admire and hard to apply, especially when the material being judged is your own. White's discipline is not meant only for critics. It is meant for anyone who compiles a resource on organized stalking, sits down with the master menu from Chapter 2, and decides what goes near the top. Not every item on that menu carries the same evidentiary weight. Pretending otherwise is precisely the error she warns against. So here is an honest sorting, applied before publication rather than after a critic forces it. 6 bands, from firmest to weakest. Solid ground, claims a hostile reader can go and check. Consistent testimony. A pattern reported across borders by people who never met. Minor but real. Contested territory. Unprovable on current evidence. And a final band for material that is not a targeting tactic at all. Each band gets its own label. Start with the firmest band. Workplace mobbing has been studied in peer-reviewed journals for decades, beginning with the workplace researcher Heinz Lehmann, whose studies in Sweden name the behaviors and the settings in which they occur. A hostile reader can find the papers, check the methods, and argue with the findings. That is what solid ground means. It does not mean the claim is beyond dispute. It means the dispute can be conducted with documents on the table. The Fry effect belongs in the same band, with one careful qualification. The microwave auditory effect, a click or a buzz heard when the head meets pulsed microwaves, was demonstrated in laboratory conditions and published under a named researcher's name. The mechanism is understood. That is the narrow question genuinely settled. It does not establish that speech can be beamed into a person's skull, at range on a street. This patch of solid ground is small. Third and fourth on the firm ground. COINTELPRO and MKUltra. Neither is a claim. Both were confirmed by Senate investigation and documented in files the government itself declassified. The knowledge base adds a courtroom example, Socialist Workers' Party against the Attorney General, in which a documented pattern of surveillance without evidence of crime, of infiltration and personal sabotage, was established in civil litigation. Citing those is citing an archive, not a rumor. Then the Bureau of Justice Statistics Stalking Supplement, catalogued as NCJ 224527. It was published by the Department of Justice using a survey method another team could repeat. It is the reason this series can speak about a confirmed multi-perpetrator minority without asking anyone to take a target's word for anything. For items, for different kinds of proof, and every one of them survives a hostile reader who actually goes and checks. The second band is different in kind. Street theater, noise campaigns, coordinated vehicle harassment. These are not laboratory findings. They are reports, made with striking consistency across borders, by people who have never met and often share no language. That consistency is real data. It is evidence of a pattern, and a pattern deserves investigation. What it is not, on its own, is proof of a mechanism or proof of who is behind it. Through-wall bodily sensations sit here too, described in a vocabulary so consistent across accounts that the consistency itself becomes a fact requiring explanation. Notice the shape of that sentence. Requiring explanation is not the same as explained. A resource that says pattern evidence has earned its place, then stops, is being honest. A resource that quietly upgrades the pattern into a proven weapon has handed a critic the only weapon that critic will ever need. TI1 Voice applied this same test to its own corpus, and the result was uncomfortable. In the platform's combined report, 16.8% of the material was classed as derived inference rather than externally verifiable data, and the report calls that a significant evidentiary gap. Its own words, documentation rich in personal narrative, with credibility constrained by a lack of independent corroboration. That is a community auditing itself in public before anyone else does. Sorted item by item, the menu reads like this. Workplace mobbing, the Fry Effect, COINTELPRO, and the Justice Department survey documented. Street theater, noise, vehicles, and through-wall sensations. Consistent testimony. Brighting and the other low-impact tactics. Minor but real and ranked low because leading with them trivializes everything underneath. Air stalking. No verification path a typical target can follow. And Monarch, which is not a tactic anybody reports experiencing at all. Contested territory is the hardest call, and the chapter's answer is a label rather than a deletion. Voice to Skull, directed at a specific person at range, has consistent testimony behind it and no publicly demonstrated mechanism under any institution's name. So it is written down as reported, mechanism contested. The knowledge base entry on acoustic pulse weapons states the same gap plainly, while noting the advocate's reply, a covert program would be difficult to verify by design. And here a concession is owed. Doubt is not always weaponized. Very often it is ordinary, reasonable, and correct. The knowledge base entry on the 1000-event memory log makes the skeptic's case without any malice. Such logs can reinforce confirmation bias, because a person cataloging hostility tends to find it, and they carry no recognized evidentiary value in a courtroom. A movement that cannot hear that criticism will keep repeating the mistake that produced it. Sorting the list by weight defeats two of the three discrediting mechanisms this chapter identifies. The third does not care about list order at all. It works through naming. Attach an unproven, lurid, and easily dismissed label to testimony that is otherwise independent of that label, and dismissing the label dismisses the testimony, without anyone having to engage with a single word of it. White names the clearest example she has met. Monarch. State the claim first, then the evidence, and keep the two apart. In the literature where the word appears, Monarch names an alleged program of extreme, ritualized child trauma, designed to fragment a mind into controllable, dissociated personalities. That is what is alleged. What supports it comes chiefly from a small number of self-described survivors, circulating largely outside mainstream publication, and resting heavily on recovered memory, a category still fiercely disputed inside psychology itself. Measured against White's own rule, demonstrated and published by a mainstream organization under its own name, Monarch fails and fails decisively. No academic body, no government agency, no mainstream institution has published a demonstration of ritual abuse personality programming under its own letterhead. Now say the next sentence carefully. That places the claim in the category of reported but not independently verified, which is not the same thing as disproven, and not the same as established. The knowledge base sets out both sides without deciding for you. Proponents infer Monarch from declassified MKUltra files, and treat the missing paperwork as proof of secrecy. Skeptics answer that those same files never mention Monarch by name, that the supporting evidence is entirely circumstantial, and that missing paperwork is a fatal flaw rather than a hidden confirmation. Both positions are recorded. Neither has been settled by a document that anybody can produce. White's objection is not aimed at survivors. It is aimed at the blurring. Organized stalking, as her book documents it, is a set of claims about coordinated harassment, surveillance, and psychological pressure, with the mobbing literature, the church committee record, and the Justice Department numbers partly behind it. Monarch is a claim about captive children and engineered personalities. Different claims, different evidence, different points on the spectrum. A serious advocate weighs them separately. The tactic erases that separation, and it does so on the cover. Take a book, a video, or a website containing genuine organized stalking testimony, street theater, workplace mobbing, noise campaigns, the psychological toll, and title it Monarch Mind Control. The tragedy is that the material inside the package may be entirely accurate. The street theater accounts may be genuine, the mobbing corroborated elsewhere, the analysis of institutional denial sound. None of it is ever reached. And a fairness note is owed here as well. Many people who use the word are not running a tactic at all. One reader, quoted in the knowledge base, said the term simply gave them a name to hang their hat on. So is that packaging ever chosen deliberately? White is careful here, and so are we. She writes that blurring Monarch with organized stalking has the appearance of deliberate disinformation. Appearance. That is a suspicion held within the community, not a finding that anyone has demonstrated, and the distance between those two sentences is the entire subject of this episode. What follows is the question the appearance raises. Who gains when the label sticks? So the packaging does the work, and the packaging arrives in 3 shapes. Eleanor White is specific about them, and her specificity matters because each format reaches a different audience, and each does its damage in a different way. Books, discs, and a slogan printed across a chest at a public rally. Take them one at a time because the remedy differs for each, and the remedy is never silence. Start with the book. A branded volume sits on a shelf, physical or digital, beside serious and properly sourced work. A librarian catalogs it. The catalog heading records the lurid word, and that record does not expire. A researcher searching years later for organized stalking finds the testimony cross-referenced under a keyword that signals, to anyone fluent in this discourse, extreme and unverified. The association outlives the book, the author, and the argument. White's point about the catalog is narrow and worth stating precisely. The book may hold valuable testimony, carefully sourced, consistent with everything documented elsewhere in this series. The catalog entry cannot tell the difference. It records a subject heading, not a judgment of quality, and that heading is what the next reader meets first. Nobody needs to be dishonest for this to happen. A convention applied correctly quietly does the discrediting. Then the discs. A branded DVD moves through informal networks, conference tables, small online stores, copies passed hand to hand. It carries a cover, a dramatic image, a lurid phrase, and that cover reaches far more people than the content ever will. A journalist walks past a merchandise table at a targeted individual conference, reads the spine, forms an impression of the movement's seriousness, or its lack of seriousness, and never presses play. That sequence deserves naming because it closes on itself. The cover is seen. An impression forms in a second or two. The disc stays unplayed. The movement is judged on the strength of a graphic. Nothing in that loop involves examining a single account, checking a single citation, or meeting a single target. And the loop runs identically whether the material inside is rigorous or worthless. The packaging has already decided. The t-shirt is the starkest case, and the one White seems to find most frustrating. Testimony reduced to a slogan. A long, partly corroborated phenomenon reduced to a brand, worn in public, where a single glance from a passing official or a possible ally forms an entire impression. The shirt makes no argument, projects a name, and in passing, that name becomes the movement's public face, perhaps its only face. Consider what a slogan cannot say. It cannot say that workplace mobbing has sat in peer-reviewed literature for decades under named researchers. It cannot mention the Church Committee's documentation of COINTELPRO harassment methods, or the Bureau of Justice Statistics findings on multi-offender stalking, or the cross-border consistency of testimony this series has traced. It communicates one thing. This movement deals in extreme, unverified mind control claims. The observer moves on, impression complete. Be clear about what White is not saying. She is not saying books are the problem or video, or that a movement should never print merchandise. All three have honest, ordinary uses in any advocacy campaign. Her complaint is narrow and specific. It concerns naming. It concerns putting an unproven, lurid program name on material whose actual contents do not depend, in any way, on that program being real or ever having existed. So the fix is not silence, and it is not censorship. It is honest labeling. Call the book accounts of organized harassment, rather than something borrowed from an unproven program. Call the shirt target testimony. Plain, accurate titles that describe what is genuinely inside. Then the testimony stands on its own footing, considerable and partial and real, without borrowing credibility from a claim never demonstrated, or sinking by association with one. Step back now and name the underlying mechanism, because naming a thing is the first step in resisting it. This is guilt by association but manufactured, and manufactured through a marketing decision rather than through any dishonesty about the facts. That distinction is the whole of it. Once you can see the mechanism clearly, you begin to notice it operating in places far beyond one word on one book cover. Notice what this mechanism does not require. Nobody has to fabricate a claim. The testimony inside the branded book can be accurate, sourced, and consistent with everything documented elsewhere in this series, and the damage still lands. The damage is done by the title word alone. That word carries enough preloaded skepticism that it performs the critic's work before the critic lifts a finger, or even opens the cover to look at what is inside. It mirrors the tactic described earlier in this chapter. The trivializing list manipulates order. The branded title manipulates naming. Both produce the same outcome. A confident, negative verdict on material the reader never examined, formed entirely from a presentational feature with no bearing on evidentiary quality. What was listed first? What the package was called? Neither of those facts tells you anything about what the evidence actually shows. Only the evidence can tell you that. The knowledge base entry on bad jacketing, the COINTELPRO practice of falsely labeling an activist and informant, records the same asymmetry. A label attaches instantly and detaches slowly, if it detaches at all. Bad jacketing is documented, confirmed in the government's own files. But note the limit carefully. Nobody has shown that any particular book title was planted by anyone. The parallel here concerns how labels behave over time, not who applied this particular one. Which brings the hardest question, and the limit of what can honestly be said. A branding choice like this can be deployed deliberately by an adversary, or triggered accidentally by a sincere community member who does not understand what it sets off. From outside, the two look identical. No investigation has established which is happening in any given case, and this series will not guess. The mechanism is documented. The intent is not. One more thing needs saying plainly. Doubt is not always weaponized. A reader who sees an extreme claim on a cover and declines to spend an evening on it is doing what careful readers do most of the time, and doing it reasonably. Skepticism becomes a tactic only when it replaces examination and is then used to close a question down. Frequently, it is nothing more sinister than limited attention. Which raises the obvious question. If order and naming are unreliable guides, what is a reliable one? White answers in a single sentence, printed in her book with an emphasis she uses almost nowhere else. It is not a suggestion and it is not a guideline. In a text that formats sparingly, capital letters signal that this is the spine of her entire argument. Here it is in her words. The capitals on demonstrated are White's own. Read that sentence slowly and you find two separate hurdles joined by one small word. And both must be cleared. Neither suffices alone because each alone admits claims that ought to be kept out. A demonstration nobody published cannot be inspected. A publication with nothing demonstrated inside it is simply an assertion wearing much better clothes. So take them in turn, beginning with the first. Hurdle 1. Demonstrated. Has anyone actually shown the effect under conditions another party could check, replicate, or verify? Demonstration means more than testimony, however consistent and however moving that testimony is. This matters, and it is easily misread. Consistent testimony is real evidence of a pattern. It is simply a different category from demonstration, and conflating the two is the root of most overclaiming in this field, and of much avoidable damage. Hurdle 2. Published, attributably. Was the demonstration issued under a real organization's own banner, a university press, a peer-reviewed journal, a government agency, a Senate committee with a name that can be checked, contacted, and held responsible if the claim proves wrong? Anonymity fails this outright. However convincing an unsigned document reads, no one stands behind it, so no one can be questioned, and nobody else can build upon it. Put the two hurdles together, and a claim that clears them holds two properties. It has been shown, not merely asserted. And the showing was done by somebody willing to put a name on it, in a forum where that name carries institutional weight and real consequence. That is the test. What makes it more than a skeptic's cudgel is where White chooses to point it, and she points it next squarely at her own community. Both hurdles matter. But the most important feature of Eleanor White's test is not how it is built. It is where she points it. She does not hand it only to skeptics, as a weapon against her own community's claims. She turns it inward, applying the same bar to material circulating inside the organized stalking movement, including the material that is most widely shared, most deeply felt, and most central to how many targets understand themselves. This is a double posture, and it is unusual. Defend the community against unfair external dismissal. Then police the community's own claims just as rigorously. White is not only warning about bad actors outside. She is warning her readers that some material circulating among them does more harm than good, because it cannot survive the scrutiny the community rightly demands of its critics. That is an uncomfortable thing to write, and she writes it anyway. Now the idea that carries the rest of this chapter. A claim that fails the test is not thereby proven false. Unproven and disproven are different words describing different situations, and the difference is lost constantly, in advocacy and in criticism alike. Failing the demonstration test today leaves the question genuinely open, pending evidence that does not exist yet. New demonstrations, published under real names, could clear the bar tomorrow. Nothing here forecloses that. Set the two words side by side. Unproven means nobody has yet shown the thing under conditions another party could check. Disproven means somebody has shown that it does not happen. Only the second closes the question. And a third confusion belongs here too. A claim that fails the standard is not, for that reason, a planted one. Sloppiness, hope, and honest error explain far more of what circulates than any campaign does. White's standard rewards a particular way of speaking. Consider a target who says 4 things in sequence. I have experienced voice to skull. Others report it in strikingly consistent language. The Fry effect shows that microwave auditory perception is physically possible. And a field-deployable mechanism has not been publicly demonstrated. Those are 4 statements at 4 different levels of confidence, each properly labeled. Nothing is hidden, nothing is inflated, and every part can be examined separately. Compare the compressed version. The government is beaming voices into my head with microwave weapons, and the Fry effect proves it. What is claimed there is a fielded weapon. What the evidence actually shows is a laboratory mechanism. Treating one as the other is overclaiming, and it hands a perfectly legitimate objection to any critic who wants to dismiss the whole testimony, including the parts that are careful, documented, and sound. A fair concession is owed here. Doubt is not always a weapon. Very often it is ordinary, reasonable, and exactly what a careful reader should bring. The knowledge base entry on flooding the zone reserves the phrase weaponized skepticism for something narrower. promoting doubt about matters already established, by demanding standards of proof that cannot be met. That is a specific abuse. It is not the same thing as asking a hard question. The Fry effect is the cleanest illustration of how the standard sorts claims, and its history is instructive. In 1962, Alan H. Fry published in the Journal of Applied Physiology a finding that pulsed microwave energy could be perceived as sound. Other researchers replicated it. By the 1970s, thermoelastic expansion supplied the mechanism. What had sounded like fringe speculation became ordinary physics. Demonstrated, published, attributed, and checkable by anyone with the equipment. So on the narrow question of mechanism, the Fry effect clears both hurdles cleanly. It was demonstrated under controlled laboratory conditions. It was published under a named researcher in a mainstream peer-reviewed journal. It was replicated and the physics is modeled. Nobody advocating for targets needs to hedge about this part. On the specific question of whether modulated microwave energy can produce an auditory percept, the answer is established science. Now watch where the honest line falls. Think of 3 rungs. The physics, pulsed microwave energy can produce an auditory percept, and that is demonstrated. The device, hardware reproducing the effect covertly at meaningful range, outside a laboratory, which has not been publicly demonstrated. The deployment, such hardware aimed at a selected individual, which has not been publicly demonstrated either. The standard applies to each rung separately. Only the first rung has cleared it. The skeptic's strongest objection lives on that second rung, and it deserves stating plainly. The knowledge base entry on the Fry effect notes that the power densities needed to produce it in the laboratory are substantially higher than ordinary ambient radio frequency levels, which raises real questions about covert, continuous operation. This Cornell entry adds that the research was published openly and replicated without evidence of weaponized use. Advocates answer that open work does not preclude classified work. So the disciplined formulation holds both halves together whenever the Fry effect is cited. The physics of the microwave auditory effect is established, demonstrated, published, attributed. The specific claim that a covert, field-deployable device is being used against individuals at range has not been publicly demonstrated under a named institution's banner. Not yet. Both halves are true. Said together, the sentence is very hard to turn against the person saying it. With that discipline in hand, White sorts the field. Some claims clear the bar outright, and the community should say so loudly and without apology. Workplace mobbing, documented for decades in peer-reviewed literature. The Fry effect on the narrow question of mechanism. COINTELPRO and MKUltra, both confirmed by the United States Senate's own committee, and a federal victimization survey published under the Department of Justice's name. None of that is contested history. Take workplace mobbing first. Heinz Lehmann and the investigators who followed him documented it for decades, in peer-reviewed academic literature, at named institutions under their own names. Coordinated harassment by a group against a single individual is an established phenomenon. The argument is only about where it happens. That it occurs beyond the conventional workplace, as targets describe, is an extension of a demonstrated concept, not a separate claim invented from nothing. Then the government's own files. COINTELPRO and MKUltra were both confirmed by the Senate's Church Committee, across 1975 and 1976, published under the Senate's own name, documented in declassified internal memoranda, and corroborated by sworn testimony. Anonymous harassment, false rumors, manufactured social conflict, contacts with employers and landlords, reputational destruction. Those methods are not alleged by this series. They are recorded by the government that used them in its own paperwork. And the statistics. The Bureau of Justice Statistics report catalogued as NCJ 224527 found that 3.4 million people aged 18 and over were stalked in a 12-month period. That number is official, with a replicable methodology and nationally representative sampling. But note the boundary carefully. Reading the data as evidence for organized stalking is White's extrapolation, not the Bureau's finding, and this series keeps the two apart deliberately. Now the harder list, and the tone should not change when we reach it. Voice to skull at range against selected individuals. Through-wall bodily sensations at range. Air stalking. Monarch-branded claims of ritual abuse programming. Remote neural monitoring, sometimes called synthetic telepathy. None of these has been publicly demonstrated under a named institution's banner. Listing them honestly is not a betrayal of anybody. It is the only way the first list keeps its force. Voice to skull at range is the hardest case because the underlying mechanism does pass. The testimony is consistent, it is widespread, and it deserves investigation. What is missing is the demonstration itself. The knowledge base records that no operational voice to skull system has been publicly confirmed, and that a short definition in a military reference tool, later the subject of a Freedom of Information request, is a bureaucratic artifact rather than a working device. Two more briefly. Through-wall bodily sensations. Focused ultrasound can produce tactile sensations, and electromagnetic fields can stimulate nerve and muscle in narrow laboratory contexts. A covert, range-capable, individually targeted device has not been shown. Air stalking. White herself calls this unprovable on current evidence, since no published method lets an ordinary target verify aerial surveillance. When the author of the standard turns it on her own community, the standard is working. Which brings us to the distinction everything here rests on, and the one most easily mangled. Nothing on that second list has been declared false. It has been declared not yet proven, which is a different category, with room in it for evidence that has not arrived. The Fry effect itself once sat on the harder list. What that distinction costs a movement that forgets it is where this chapter goes next. Notice what that second list does not say. Not one of those claims is declared false. Each is declared honestly not yet proven, and that is a different category from disproven. Disproven closes a question. Not yet proven leaves it open, waiting on evidence that has not arrived. Eleanor White's standard describes what has been shown so far. It does not claim to describe what is ultimately true. That modesty is the whole point. The difference is not a technicality. A disproven claim has been tested and has failed, and the file on it is closed. An unproven claim has simply not been demonstrated in public yet, under a real name at a named institution. Nothing about it has been refuted. That leaves room for future evidence to move an item from one list to the other. And the history of this very field shows exactly that happening. It has happened here before. When Alan Fry first reported that pulsed microwave energy could produce a sound inside the head, the claim sat well outside the mainstream. He published it in 1962 in a physiology journal under his own name. Other laboratories replicated the finding. By the 1970s, a mechanism, thermoelastic expansion, had been modeled. The claim crossed from fringe to textbook without anyone rewriting the rules of evidence. So why does overclaiming matter this much? Because it hands a critic something usable. Say flatly that remote neural monitoring is real and being deployed against targets, and you have asserted as settled fact a claim with no public demonstration behind it. The objection writes itself, and it is a fair objection, not a smear. The critic never has to argue anything harder, because you have offered them the easiest available exit. Consider what that exit lets a critic skip. They never have to engage with the Federal Stalking Survey from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. They never have to read Heinz Lehman on workplace mobbing. They never have to open the Church Committee's own documentation of SOINTELPRO, or the physics of the Fry effect. All of that sits on the public record under real names, and one overclaim lets them walk past every page. The knowledge base makes a point worth holding on to here. The The word disinformation cuts in two directions. It names a genuine tool of deception, and it also serves as a label people reach for when they want an inconvenient claim to go away. Both uses are live in this field, which is precisely why a community defending itself against dismissal has to be scrupulous about the accuracy of its own claims. But there is an opposite error, and it deserves equal weight. Waving away consistent testimony as worthless, simply because it has not met a laboratory standard, is its own kind of failure. Hundreds of people across borders and across decades, describing structurally similar experiences in structurally similar language, are not nothing. That is not laboratory evidence. It is still evidence of a different kind, and it deserves to be named as such. That structure is now being measured rather than guessed at. The knowledge base describes a documentation initiative called SCORE, which grades every submitted account on corroboration density, completeness, timing, and cross-referencing on a scale from 0 to 10. It projected some 14,000 participants and over 1.4 million structured submissions. That figure is a projection, not a result. But the instinct behind it is right. Count the structure, do not merely assert it. And here honesty cuts toward the skeptic. Structural similarity can have innocent explanations. One internal analysis in the knowledge base found large clusters of near-identical incident reports that turned out to share a common logging template. So the resemblance came from the form and not from the events. Doubt is not always weaponized. Very often it is ordinary, reasonable, and exactly what a careful reader ought to bring to unfamiliar material. So the honest posture holds the test and the testimony together, claim by claim. This part has been demonstrated and published under a named institution. This part has been reported consistently by many independent witnesses, but has not been independently verified. This part is genuinely unknown. 3 sentences, 3 different levels of confidence, and no contradiction between them. That is not hedging. It is simply accuracy, and it takes only a few extra words. Laid out claim by claim, the field is not one thing at all. Workplace mobbing, the Fry effect, COINTELPRO, and the Federal Stalking Survey stand on documented ground. Voice to skull at range, through-wall sensations, air stalking, and monarch-branded programming sit in the reported column, awaiting verification. Remote neural monitoring sits furthest out, with no demonstrated mechanism anywhere in the public scientific literature. Each item stands or falls entirely on its own merits. That is the discipline. Which brings the chapter to its final question, and it is the largest one. Why would anyone bother weaponizing doubt against a community of harassment victims? These are not powerful people. They rarely control institutions, budgets, or newsrooms. The answer lies in how credibility behaves inside a stigmatized field. Once that mechanism is visible, the strange economics of this whole problem come sharply into focus, and so does the defense. In a field like this one, credibility is not a private possession. It is a commons, shared, finite, and pooled. A single overclaimed post on a widely read forum damages the standing of every target whose testimony is sober, careful, and well documented. The outside reader arriving for the first time does not sort the careful from the careless. They meet what they perceive as one community, and they judge all of it together. The judgment usually travels by association. A weak item circulates in the same space as careful work. A newcomer meets the weak item first, dismisses it, and quietly files the entire subject under things not worth taking seriously. The well-documented testimony sitting one click away is discredited without ever being examined. Nobody argued against it. Nobody read it. That is the mechanism, and it is brutally efficient because it costs whoever benefits nothing at all. Which explains why disinformation would be such an efficient weapon here, if it were being used. An attacker would not need to refute the careful target's evidence. They would only need dismissible material circulating nearby. Note the conditional carefully. That some material in this ecosystem is easy to dismiss is observable. That any particular item was planted deliberately is the community's suspicion, not a finding, and no public investigation has ever established it. What can be examined is cost. Standing up a trivializing website takes an afternoon. A domain registration and basic hosting. Tens of dollars. Formatting a self-published book takes a cover design and an evening. Repairing the reputational damage such items cause takes the community years of patient sourcing and disciplined self-presentation, and it may never fully succeed, because the next skeptical reader meets both bodies of material and may judge from the weaker one. And no outside authority is coming to fix this. No editor fact-checks a self-published book before it appears beside properly sourced work. No platform's moderation policy distinguishes well-sourced from poorly sourced claims about organized stalking, because the field is too marginal and too contested for that nuance ever to have been built. No licensing board inspects the merchandise table at a conference. The gap is structural and it is nobody's job. The architecture of the Internet itself sets these terms. Publishing costs almost nothing now, and correction costs a great deal. A claim can be posted once and copied 1,000 times before anyone thinks to check it, while a retraction reaches a fraction of the original audience. A community with limited resources and a fragile reputation is unusually exposed to that asymmetry. It is not a conspiracy. It is arithmetic. The knowledge base puts the wider damage plainly in its study of disinformation tactics. Falsehoods, once they become pervasive, corrode the trust that holds communities together, and the smallest groups feel that erosion first. That is exactly what a stigmatized group cannot afford to lose, because outside trust is very nearly the only currency it has. Which leads to the conclusion White reaches, and it is an uncomfortable one for the community she is actually writing to. The defense has to be built from the inside. Nobody else is going to build it. That is why Eleanor White spends a chapter of a book written to convince outsiders warning insiders that some of their own material is doing damage. And she does not leave them with a scolding. She leaves them with a tool, small enough to use in the seconds before pressing share. 3 questions coming up next. So the defense has to be built from inside, and it begins in the smallest possible place. The moment before someone presses share. White standard is a test. What the community needs is a habit. Section 8.7.2 turns that standard into 3 plain questions, asked every time of every claim, every link, every resource before it goes out in public. 3 questions. A few seconds each. Let's take them one at a time. Question 1. Demonstrated how? Question 2. Published where? Question 3. Who actually signs it? Notice what the checklist does not ask. It does not ask whether the claim feels true, or whether it matches what you have lived through, or whether people you trust believe it. Those are real things, but they are not tests of evidence. The checklist asks only what can be shown, where it was shown, and who stands behind it. Demonstrated how? White wants a specific answer. Under laboratory conditions, with a method another laboratory could repeat. In a documented case study with named investigators. Through a government inquiry that published a report anyone can read. If the honest answer is none of those, if the claim circulates because it resonates, because it fits what the community already believes, then it has not been demonstrated. That is not an insult. It is a category. The 3 questions run in order, and the order matters. Demonstration first, because a claim that was never demonstrated cannot be rescued by where it was printed. Publication second, because a demonstration nobody wrote down is a rumor about a demonstration. Attribution last, because a name is what makes the first 2 checkable. And the output is never simply yes or no. The output is a label, and the label travels with the claim. Published where? A named journal that sends papers to reviewers. a government agency's letterhead, a university press with an address and a legal department. Against that, an anonymous forum post, an unsigned document circulating as an attachment, a personal blog with no institution behind it. The knowledge base holds material of both kinds, and the difference is not snobbery. It is that one kind can be checked, and the other kind cannot. Who actually signs it? A real name, an institution that can be telephoned, a logo that belongs to something with a registered address and a reputation to lose. The point of a signature is not authority. The point of a signature is liability. Someone is standing behind the claim and can be held to it if the claim turns out to be wrong. Where there is no name, there is no one to hold. And here is the move that makes the checklist usable rather than censorious. If a claim fails the first two questions, White's answer is not to delete it. It is to relabel it, call it reported, call it testimony, call it contested or unverified or under investigation. Say plainly what has been shown, and say plainly what is still unknown. Nothing is silenced. Something is simply accurately described, and it costs a handful of words. These words are not softeners. Each one carries a different claim about evidence. Reported means someone said it. Testimony means someone said it under their own name and stands by it. Corroborated means several independent people said the same thing. Documented means a record exists. Demonstrated means it was shown under conditions someone else could repeat. Choosing the right word is the whole of the discipline. A small vocabulary doing a great deal of work. The knowledge base contains a working example. The TI One Voice Declaration version 3.1 carries a section headed "What this declaration does not do." It states that it does not start an investigation, does not guarantee anyone will believe you, does not provide legal representation, and does not stop the attacks. That list is unusual. Most advocacy documents advertise only what they promise. This one publishes its own limits. That sentence comes from a community report held in the knowledge base, and it is worth admiring for its restraint. It does not claim the case is proved. It claims a narrower thing the evidence can carry. But note that the report itself is unsigned, with no institution behind it. Careful wording inside an anonymous document still fails the third question. And so the honest label here is reported, not established. Grading is not only a metaphor. The knowledge base describes an initiative called SCORE, in which structured attack documentation interviews are scored on a scale of 0 to 10. The score weighs corroboration density, completeness of the data, how close the report was made to the event, and how well it cross-references other accounts. Note what that scale measures. Not whether a target is telling the truth, how much of the account can be checked. The checklist will not stop anyone printing a trivializing list or selling a badly named t-shirt. Whether such things are planted or merely careless, White does not establish, and nor can we. What the checklist does is ensure the skeptical outsider who finds them also finds, the same day, work that is careful and properly sourced. The gap between the two is visible, and the gap is the defense. Judging any group by its weakest members is unjust. Which brings the chapter to its closing image, and it is a builder's image. Picture everything the community has collected, every study, every log, every testimony, as ground. Ground that outsiders are being asked to stand on. Some of that ground is bedrock. Some of it is sand. They look similar from above. The difference only appears when weight is put on them. This is section 8.7.3. Bedrock is any claim that clears White's standard. Demonstrated, published, attributed. It holds because it exists independently of anyone's belief in it. A critic may dislike the conclusion and dispute what it implies, but a critic cannot make a published finding disappear. Sand is any claim that has only been asserted sincerely, repeatedly, by many people but never shown. Inside the community it feels solid. Outside it, it is not. White's own examples are all checkable. Alan Fry published the microwave hearing effect in 1962 in a physiology journal under his name. Stolen bureau files exposed SOINTLPRO in 1971, and the Church Committee documented it in the years after. Heinz Lehmann published the workplace mobbing research in 1990. The Bureau of Justice Statistics published its National Stalking Survey in 2009. None of that can be printed away. Sand is not a synonym for lie. Much of it is sincere. Some of it may even turn out to be true. The problem is not honesty. The problem is load-bearing. A claim that has only ever been repeated will carry weight inside a room of people who already believe it, and will give way the moment it is carried into a room of people who do not. And that is always the room that matters. There are 3 rooms in particular. A courtroom, where a hostile lawyer has time and motive to test every sentence. A newsroom, where a reporter checks the sourcing before the story runs. And an official's office, where a skeptical civil servant decides whether to open a file. The knowledge base notes, for instance, that incident logs currently carry no recognized evidentiary value in court. That is worth knowing before the hearing, not during it. It has to be said plainly, none of those 3 people is necessarily an enemy. A lawyer testing a sentence, a reporter checking a source, an official asking what was measured. That is the job, and a community that wants to be believed needs people who do it. The knowledge base reserves the phrase weaponized skepticism for something narrower. Doubt raised by demanding proof that could not exist, in order to end the conversation. So why does anyone build on sand? Because drama works. Drama gets attention, gets shared, cuts through a saturated feed. And it is exactly backwards for durability. Mix one dramatic unverified claim into 10 solid ones, and the critic will test the weak one first, find it wanting, and declare the whole structure unsound. The critic never has to touch the rock. The sand supplies all the ammunition a critic needs. In places, White's chapter reads less like a manifesto than like a structural engineer's inspection report. It is not trying to maximize the number, the scope, or the drama of the claims the community can make. It is trying to ensure that whatever claims it does make, fewer, narrower, more carefully qualified, survive the pressure they will meet. Next, the 3 pieces of that assembled defense, laid out on one table. So the inspection report is finished, and what it leaves behind is not a manifesto but a set of tools. Eleanor White's chapter has put 3 pieces on the table, each doing different defensive work, each incomplete on its own. Before we turn to what a community actually does with them, it is worth laying them out side by side and asking plainly what each one protects against and what it cannot. Piece 1 is the discrediting playbook. Deny, then ridicule, then pathologize. Piece 2 is the pair of traps, the trivializing list and the contaminated brand. Piece 3 is the standard, demonstrated, and published under a mainstream name or logo. Not one of the 3 is a rebuttal to any particular claim. Together they describe how a stigmatized subject gets handled, and how a community can decline to hand over the ammunition. White's first piece is the recognition that the playbook is a script. It is not a series of evidence-based responses to specific claims. It is a reusable sequence, and it has documented precedent. The people harmed by MKUltra and by COINTELPRO went on being mocked and quietly written off after the Senate's Church Committee had confirmed both programs on the record. Confirmation did not restore them. That is White's evidence that the sequence outlives the case. Notice what the 3 moves have in common. Denial at least contests the claim. Ridicule contests nothing at all. It simply makes engagement socially expensive. Pathologizing moves the subject away from the claim and onto the claimant. Each step retreats further from the evidence and further into the speaker's exposure. Recognizing that as one script, rather than 3 separate judgments about 3 separate facts, is the first step to refusing to be destabilized by it. The second piece is the pair of traps. One works on list order. Promote a trivial or unverifiable item to the top, and a first-time reader anchors there, before ever reaching the well-documented material further down. The other works on naming. Attach a lurid, unproven program label to testimony that does not depend on it. Neither requires fabricating a single fact. Both damage by association rather than by argument, and both work regardless of intent. That last point deserves care, because this is an episode about false claims and it has to be scrupulous about its own. White argues that criminals who depend on public ignorance work to discredit their victims. What she demonstrates is the pattern and its effect. Whether any particular website or t-shirt was planted deliberately, she does not establish, and neither can we. The mechanism is documented. The motive behind any single instance is not. The third piece is the standard White applies. Has the thing been demonstrated, and was the demonstration published under a mainstream name or logo that somebody can check and hold responsible? What gives the test its value is that she points it inward as well as outward. The same bar that answers a hostile critic gets applied to the community's own favorite material. A test used only against opponents is not a standard. It is a weapon. And here is the distinction the rest of this section rests on. A claim that fails the test has not been shown to be false. It has been shown to be undemonstrated, which is a different and much smaller finding. That gap protects the community from overclaiming while leaving the door open for evidence that has not arrived yet. The microwave auditory effect spent years on the wrong side of that line before the laboratory work landed. Three pieces, then, with one shared purpose. And White's conclusion is that the fight over this subject's credibility is not settled only in courtrooms, legislative chambers, and Senate hearing rooms. It is settled in quiet, ordinary decisions: what to share, how to rank a list, what to title a resource, how to label a claim. Multiplied across thousands of people over years, those decisions are what a movement's public face is actually made of. Which leads to the first and, in this chapter's reading, the most important shift of all, and it is conceptual rather than practical. Most targets, especially early in the ordeal, treat credibility as a personal possession. My credibility, something I earn or lose by how I behave. The analysis here says that in a stigmatized field, that is simply the wrong model. Credibility is not held individually. It is pooled and it is spent collectively. Every target's restraint protects every other target's testimony. Every target's overclaim reduces every other target's chance of being believed. That is an uncomfortable claim, and it is worth being precise about its standing. It is an argument about how stigmatized communities get judged, drawn from this chapter's analysis. It is not a measured finding with a number attached. But the mechanism is easy to see once it has been named, and most targets recognize it immediately. The chapter's own example is deliberately unglamorous. Somebody exhausted and sleepless, desperate for confirmation, shares an unverified article about remote neural monitoring at 2 in the morning. The harm is not mainly to them. It joins the ambient information environment that the next skeptical journalist, the next curious legislator, the next possible ally will meet when they go searching. They will not meet that one post. They will meet its accumulated weight. It is worth saying clearly what this is not. It is not a call to suppress testimony, and it is not a demand that anybody stay quiet about what happened to them. It is a call to recognize interdependence. The target who pauses, who asks the three questions from earlier in this chapter, who writes reported where reported is the honest word, is performing community defense as real as any protest or any legal filing. An episode about weaponized doubt owes the skeptic a fair hearing, because a great deal of doubt here is ordinary and reasonable. The knowledge base says so about the community's own tools. Its entry on personal event logs notes that such logs carry no recognized evidentiary value in court and can reinforce confirmation bias. A separate analysis of submitted documents found the dominant pattern was near-identical reporting templates, repeated across different people. None of that is a reason to stop documenting. It is a reason to label, and the vocabulary is small enough to memorize. Demonstrated means shown under conditions somebody else could repeat. Reported means many people say it consistently, and that is real data about a pattern. Contested means credible parties disagree. Not yet demonstrated is honest, and it leaves the door open. Disproven is a far stronger word, and it is rarely the right one. The second prescription is institutional, and it is the most practical thing in the chapter. The quality control functions that keep other fields honest, fact-checking before publication, peer review before acceptance, citation specific enough to check, have largely not been performed for this material by anybody. White's argument is that if the mainstream declines to perform them, the community has to perform them itself, and has to be seen performing them. That is the model the One Voice knowledge base and the TI One Voice project have adopted at one.witisk.org. Every document graded by evidentiary weight. Every claim labeled reported, contested, or established. Every source cited specifically enough that a hostile reader can go and check it. This is not a substitute for mainstream academic validation. Nothing substitutes for that, and the community should carry on pursuing it. A grading ladder does two jobs at once. It tells a reader where a document sits before they read a word of it, and it forces the compiler to decide, in public, which rung the material belongs on. Related knowledge base work runs on the same logic. One documentation initiative weighted corroboration density, completeness, how soon a report was filed, and cross-referencing, on a 0 to 10 scale. That is a published method and a checkable one. The design principle is transparency, and the failure mode is easy to describe. An institution that claims to have vetted material without ever showing how it vetted anything simply reproduces the problem it was built to solve. One that shows its standards, names its reviewers, publishes its method, and invites outsiders to attack it earns credibility slowly, one documented claim at a time. That is the difference between a walled garden and a public library. The community needs libraries, not gardens. And a library gets built the way a wall gets built, one course at a time, often by people who will not live to see it finished. Which brings us to the hardest prescription in the entire chapter, and the one nobody wants to hear: patience. The institutional denial in this field has been accumulating for more than 2 decades. What it takes to outlast it is where we go next. Transparent institutions can be built. What they cannot do is deliver recognition quickly. So the chapter turns to its final and most difficult prescription, and it is the one nobody wants to hear: patience. The institutional denial described earlier in this series has been accumulating for more than 2 decades. It will not be reversed by a single news cycle, a single court victory, or a single legislative session. The fight for recognition is generational, not seasonal. Patience is not the same as hopelessness, and the chapter is careful about that distinction. Saying the fight is generational does not mean the fight is lost. It means the fight has to be built for durability rather than for speed, like a road laid for traffic that has not arrived yet. Everything that follows in this section is a design choice about what will still be standing in 20 years, rather than what will trend tomorrow. The community does put dates on the board. The knowledge base holds a study addendum that builds what it calls a recognition index, and under a base case of 14,000 declarants it projects law enforcement recognition around early 2029, governmental acknowledgement later that year, and medical recognition around 2030. Those are model outputs, not forecasts of fact. The assumptions are published so a skeptical reader can argue with them. That transparency is the point. Here the chapter makes its sharpest claim about strategy. Dramatic claims that generate short-term attention but collapse under scrutiny are, in its words, worse than useless. They spend something the community cannot easily replace. Call it a credibility budget. Every collapsed claim draws down the balance, and the next careful witness pays the overdraft. Speed buys a headline and durability buys a record, and only one of those is still there in 10 years. Careful, qualified claims that survive scrutiny accumulate. The chapter's image is a wall built brick by brick, each addition making the structure stronger, rather than merely heavier. It is an unglamorous picture of advocacy. No single brick persuades anybody, but a hostile critic can dismiss one anecdote in a sentence, and cannot dismiss hundreds of dated, cross-referenced, properly sourced accounts without doing real work. The wall is built out of other people's labor, most of it never seen. The chapter reaches for the precedent it has used throughout, and it reads that precedent in both directions. The Federal Bureau of Investigation ran its counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, from 1956. It operated for 15 years before the public learned of it. 15 years of documented, later declassified operations against American citizens, invisible the entire time. That is the discouraging direction. It tells you how long an official denial can hold while nobody outside can see the files. And the encouraging direction is how the secrecy actually ended. It was not an internal reform, and it was not an inspector general. In March 1971, a group calling itself the Citizens Commission to investigate the Bureau broke into a field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and took the files. The knowledge base entry on that burglary calls it a documented precedent for covert harassment of individuals and groups. Exposure required an external shock. What happened afterwards matters more than the burglary itself. Once exposed, the program stayed exposed. The church committee's documentation is permanent. The declassified files sit in the National Archives, and anybody can ask for them. This is the chapter's central structural point about time. Denial is a live activity that has to be renewed every single day by somebody willing to renew it. Public record is not. The historical record, once established, cannot be unestablished. So the lesson the chapter draws is narrow and practical. Build the record. Careful, documented, properly sourced, publicly accessible. That is the work which outlasts any single denial, any single dismissal, any single discrediting campaign. It is slow, unrewarding, and it does not feel like fighting back. The knowledge-based grading conventions exist for exactly this reason, marking each claim as reported, contested, or established, so a reader 20 years from now can tell which is which. The chapter puts the contrast in one sentence, and it is the strongest sentence in the section. The standard reply can close a police complaint in 30 seconds. It cannot close a published, cross-referenced, properly sourced body of evidence sitting in the public domain, independently of any single official's willingness to acknowledge it. A desk officer can end a conversation. Nobody can end a citation. That asymmetry is the entire argument for patience. A fair word for the skeptics here, because this episode owes them one. Doubt is not always a weapon. Very often it is ordinary, reasonable, and correct, and a claim that cannot survive it probably should not be repeated. The knowledge base draws its line at what it calls weaponized skepticism, meaning demands for proof that the circumstances make impossible to supply. Asking for evidence is not that. Asking for evidence nobody could ever produce is. All of which can feel abstract to somebody living inside it right now. Institutional architecture, credibility budgets, generational strategy, none of it helps much at 3 in the morning. So the chapter closes its prescriptive section by turning to the individual, and it begins by conceding how little of any of this a single person controls. That concession is not defeatism. It is the setup for a much shorter and far more useful list. You cannot control the trivializing lists. You cannot control monarch-branded merchandise, or the deny, ridicule, and pathologize sequence, or the non-belief loop, or the institutional machinery of denial. The chapter is blunt about that. What remains is your own information practice, and it turns out to be 4 things. Apply the checklist before you share. Label your claims honestly. Build your own archive. Then contribute it, properly framed, to the shared record. On archives, the chapter asks for 4 qualities: dated, specific, contemporaneous, honest. The knowledge base is candid about the limits here. Its entry on the 1000-event memory log notes that such logs carry no recognized evidentiary value in court, and that critics warn they can reinforce confirmation bias when only the confirming events get written down. That criticism is worth taking seriously rather than resenting. A log that records the quiet days too is much harder to dismiss. A related finding in the knowledge base is worth hearing. An anonymized analysis of submissions to the platform at one.witisk.org found large clusters of near-identical documents, with one attack log template appearing word for word across different users. Shared templates make data comparable, which is useful. They also make testimony look coordinated, which is expensive. Keep the structure, then write the incident in your own words because the details are the part nobody can template. And then the chapter says the thing it has been building towards all episode, addressed to one person rather than to a movement. The disbelief you meet is not a verdict on your sanity. It is a procedure, a script that predates you, and that would be run against anybody making the claims you are making, whether or not those claims happen to be true. Read that last part carefully because it cuts in both directions. It cuts in both directions because the script's uniformity proves nothing about the underlying facts. A standard response would be deployed against a true claim and a false one in exactly the same way. So recognizing the playbook does not make you right. What it does is remove one bad argument from the room, the argument that everybody disbelieves you and therefore you must be wrong. The playbook works, the chapter says, by making you doubt yourself. Recognizing it is how you stop. That is where the individual section ends, and it hands straight into the idea this chapter considers most important of all. Because the same discipline that protects one person's testimony turns out not to belong to that person at all. Most targets, especially early in the ordeal, treat credibility as private property. My credibility earned or lost by my own behavior. In a stigmatized field, the chapter argues that is simply wrong. Credibility is pooled. Every target's restraint protects every other target's testimony, and every target's overclaim damages every other target's chances of being believed. That is a heavy thing to be told, so the chapter says plainly what it is not saying. This is not a call for censorship, and not a call to suppress genuine testimony. It is a call to recognize interdependence, which is a different and considerably older idea. So the person who pauses before sharing, who runs the 3 questions, who labels a claim reported rather than proven, is performing community defense as real as any protest or legal filing. Epistemic care is not a constraint on advocacy. It is advocacy's most powerful tool. But pooled credibility has to live somewhere, in something the community builds and maintains for itself, and that is exactly where the chapter turns next. If credibility is pooled, then somebody has to look after the pool. In most fields that job belongs to institutions, editors, referees, university presses. White's analysis runs straight into a hard fact here. For organized stalking material, those institutions have largely declined the work. So the chapter turns from what one target should do to what a community can build. The answer is unglamorous, and it begins with a question about quality control. White's point here is structural, not personal. When a chemist overclaims, an editor and 2 referees usually catch it before anyone reads a word. Organized stalking material has no such filter. No mainstream publisher checks it before publication. No journal has refereed it. Nothing on the surface separates a careful document from a careless one, so a reader outside the community judges the whole field by whatever they happen to open first. That is the gap. So the chapter's answer is to build the missing machinery inside the community itself. Not a rival to the university, but a stand-in for the referee who never came. Develop fact-checking norms and make them visible. Run a review process that is written down, dated, and open to challenge. Publish what passes and publish what failed, because any body that shows only its successes is quietly asking to be taken on trust again. This is the model the One Voice Knowledge Base and the TI One Voice project have adopted, and the chapter describes it plainly. Every document graded by the weight of evidence behind it. Every claim labeled as reported, contested, or established. Every source cited with enough specificity that a skeptical reader can go and check it without asking permission. None of that proves anything by itself. What it does is make the reasoning inspectable. The chapter is careful about what this can and cannot do, and so should we be. Community review is not a substitute for mainstream academic validation. Nothing substitutes for that, and the chapter says the community should keep pursuing it. What a parallel institution offers is a bridge, a way of producing material that meets a visible standard of care in the meantime, while the slower work of winning recognition goes on. The grading rule is not invented for the occasion. It is White's own test, the spine of her chapter, and it has two hurdles that both have to be cleared. Was the thing actually shown under conditions somebody independent could check? And was the showing published under a real organization's name, one you could write to? A parallel institution is simply that test, applied consistently in public by people who say who they are. The key design principle the chapter says is transparency, and it is easy to get wrong. An institution that claims to have vetted material without ever showing the vetting reproduces the credibility problem it was created to solve. You are once again asking to be believed on your word. An institution that shows its standards, names its reviewers, publishes its method, and invites outside scrutiny earns credibility slowly, one documented claim at a time. Picture the same collection run two ways. In the first, the vetting is asserted but never shown, the reviewers are nameless, and there is no way to contest a decision. In the second, the standards are printed, the method is written down, and a challenge from a stranger is logged rather than deleted. The documents inside can be identical. Only the second one survives a determined hostile reader, and that is the whole point. The chapter puts the distinction in one line. The community needs libraries, not gardens. A garden is curated for the people already inside it. A library is built so that a stranger can walk in, pull a book off the shelf, and check the footnotes without anybody's permission. In a field where the central problem is that outsiders do not believe you, only one of those buildings is any use. A skeptic will raise an obvious objection, and it deserves a straight answer rather than a defensive one. A community that grades its own evidence is marking its own homework. In a small field, the reviewers all know one another. That objection is reasonable, and it is not answered by insisting on good intentions. It is answered only by checkability. Publish the workings so that a disagreeing reader can go around you entirely. That brings the chapter to its final and hardest prescription, which is patience. The institutional denial described earlier in this episode has been accumulating for more than 2 decades. It will not be reversed by one news cycle, one court victory, or one legislative session. The chapter's word for the fight is generational. That is not a counsel of despair. It is an instruction about how to build and what to build with. The chapter reaches for one precedent, and it is a documented one. COINTELPRO, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's counterintelligence program, ran for roughly 15 years before it was exposed. That exposure did not come from an internal review or an inspector's conscience. It came from outside, when a citizens group burgled a field office in 1971 and handed the files to reporters. Notice what that says about how slowly institutions correct themselves. The dates are worth holding on to. The program begins in 1956. The media, Pennsylvania break-in comes in March 1971. Senate hearings open in 1975, and the Church Committee's final report, Book 2, appears in April 1976. 50 years on, those files are still public. That is the chapter's real point. Exposure needed a shock from outside, but once the record existed, no later denial could take it back. From that comes a hard-nosed rule about what to spend. Dramatic claims that win short-term attention and then collapse are, in the chapter's phrase, worse than useless. They spend a limited credibility budget on material that cannot survive the pressure it invites. Careful, qualified claims that hold up are bricks in a wall that gets stronger with every edition. A standard brush-off can close a complaint in 30 seconds. Cannot close a library. The knowledge base holds one attempt to put numbers on that patience. A TI-1 voice study addendum on official recognition models a base case of 14,000 participants by year 5, and projects law enforcement recognition first, government acknowledgement next, and medical and scientific recognition last around 2030. Treat that as exactly what it is. It is a projection from assumptions the authors publish, not a finding, and every date moves if those assumptions do. A generational strategy needs a shared vocabulary, and this is the one the chapter keeps returning to. There is a real difference between not yet demonstrated and disproven, and between reported and established. Saying which one you mean costs a few seconds. Getting it wrong costs the community years, because a single overclaim hands a critic the excuse to discard everything standing beside it. Precision here is not pedantry. It is load-bearing. Institutional analysis can feel abstract and worse, disempowering to somebody living inside the blizzard right now. So the chapter closes its prescriptive section by turning and addressing the individual target directly. It begins by conceding, without softening it, just how much is genuinely out of your hands. Then it draws a line around the small territory that is not, and argues that this small territory matters more than it looks. You cannot control the trivializing lists. You cannot control the merchandise that fuses your account with material you never claimed. White reads both as discrediting techniques, and their effect on you is real, but who produces them and why is in most cases simply not established, and this series will not pretend otherwise. What you can control is your own information practice, the checklist, the labels you use, your archive, and what you contribute. 2 honest caveats about your archive, both from the knowledge base. Its entry on the 1000-event memory log records that such logs carry no recognized evidentiary value in courts, and that critics warn they can harden confirmation bias. And a study of the platform's own submissions found many logs sharing near-identical template wording. A record still matters enormously. It simply has to be yours, dated, specific, and honest about what you did not see. White's closing argument is that the uniformity of the dismissal is evidence of a script, not evidence against you. Predates you and would meet anyone making these claims. Recognize it and it loses its grip because it works by making you doubt yourself. 2 honest qualifications. That reading is her interpretation, not a finding, and much of the doubt you meet is ordinary. What remains is to draw the argument together. Recognizing the script is where the defense begins. Where it ends is harder and quieter, and it belongs to everyone. Eleanor White closes her chapter on bogus information not with a rallying cry but with a discipline. The organized stalking community lives inside a hostile information environment, and in that environment one thing runs scarcer than evidence, scarcer than allies, scarcer even than time. Credibility. Everything this episode has argued has been, finally, about protecting it. Without credibility, the most carefully documented testimony goes unread. Without credibility, the most rigorous statistical work goes uncited. Without credibility, the most compelling personal account becomes in the public mind, just more noise from a stigmatized corner of the internet. That is White's claim, and it is not a flourish. It is a description of how attention actually works. Evidence does not speak for itself. Somebody first has to be willing to listen. So let us put the three pieces of this episode back on the table. First, the playbook. Deny, ridicule, pathologize. Second, the traps, trivializing lists and contamination by brand name. Third, the standard. Has this been demonstrated, and did a mainstream organization publish that demonstration under its own name? Each piece does different defensive work. Taken together, they are the whole argument, and each deserves restating carefully before we close this one out. The playbook moves in sequence, each move covering the weakness of the one before it. Denial sets the baseline. This does not exist. Ridicule raises the social cost of questioning that baseline. Pathologizing explains permanently why a target keeps talking anyway. Notice what none of the three requires: any examination of the evidence. The playbook operates on the claimant's exposure, not on whether the claim is true, which is why it works identically against both. The two traps are quieter, and in their way more ingenious. One manipulates order. Put the trivial and the unverifiable at the top of a list, and a stranger's impression is fixed before they ever scroll down. The other manipulates naming. Put a lurid, unproven program name on the cover, and the contents get dismissed unread. Neither trap needs anyone to invent a fact. Ranking and titling do all the damage on their own. Against both, White offers a single test with two hurdles. Has the claim been demonstrated, shown under conditions an independent party could check? And was that demonstration published under a mainstream organization's own name and logo, by people who can be contacted and held responsible if it turns out wrong? Anonymity fails the second hurdle outright, however convincing the document reads. Clear both and you stand on something. Clear neither and you stand on an assertion. And here is the sentence this episode most wants you to keep. A claim that fails the test is not thereby false. And proven and disproven are two different words describing two different situations. The microwave hearing effect was fringe speculation until Alan Fry demonstrated it and published it in 1962, under his own name in a peer-reviewed journal. The standard describes what has been shown so far, not what is ultimately true. Which means the honest move when a claim fails is never to bury it. It is to label it. Established. Consistently reported. Minor but real. Contested. Currently unverifiable. Genuinely unknown. Those phrases cost a handful of extra words, and they protect everything standing beside them, because a reader who watches you sort your own material honestly has been handed a reason to trust the parts you do assert. The labeling is itself the signal. Now a caution about this episode itself. White writes that certain websites appear to be attempts to trivialize the crime. That is her reading of a pattern, and she says as much plainly. No investigation has established who built those pages or why, and this series will not guess. The same restraint governs the branded merchandise. We can describe a mechanism and its effects without asserting an intention nobody has proved. And the skeptics deserve that same fairness. Not every doubt is weaponized. A great deal of it is ordinary, reasonable, and earned by claims the community itself overstated. Someone who reads that remote neural monitoring is proven, looks for the demonstration, finds none, and walks away is not running a playbook. They are doing what careful readers do. This episode is stronger for conceding that plainly, and weaker every single time it forgets. Picture the community's evidence as ground a stranger is being asked to stand on. Decades of peer-reviewed mobbing research, the church committee's findings, the Justice Department's stalking survey, the Fry physics, that is bedrock, and it stays there whatever anyone believes. Claims that have only ever been asserted are sand. They hold for a while among people who share the experience. They give way exactly when weight is put on them, which is the worst possible moment. So, honestly, what does this episode not know? We do not know how much damaging material is seeded by adversaries and how much is produced sincerely by exhausted people. We do not know the size of the organized stalking population. The Justice Department survey never measured it. We do not know whether any deployable device matches the testimony. And we cannot prove that any particular dismissal was strategic rather than merely lazy and unexamined. This chapter never stood alone. It leans on Chapter 2 for the menu of tactics that trivializing lists misrepresent, on Chapter 5 for the statistics and White's careful extrapolation from them, on Chapter 6 for the non-belief loop and the mental health trap, and on Chapter 7 for the oversharing that the traps are built to exploit. And it points forward, hard, to the documented origins of the playbook itself in Chapter 9. Because the playbook has a history, and the history is written down. COINTELPRO and MKUltra were confirmed by the United States Senate's Church Committee, published under the Senate's own letterhead in April 1976, and documented in declassified files anyone can read today. Those files did not unhappen when the story left the news. A record, once established, cannot be unestablished. That is the whole strategic point of building one patiently over years. 15 years. That is how long the Federal Bureau of Investigation denied COINTELPRO existed before a break-in at a small field office in 1971 forced the papers into daylight. Denial did not fail because the institution corrected itself. It failed because an outside shock made denial impossible. The lesson cuts both ways. Exposure can take a generation, but once exposure arrives, the record survives every later attempt to talk it away. White ends her chapter not with a call to arms but with a question, and she invites the reader to ask it of every claim, including her own. Here it is, in her words, has the claim been demonstrated, and has the demonstration been published by a mainstream organization under their name and logo? It is not a glamorous defense. It will not trend and it will not generate headlines, but it will outlast the noise. Every claim in this episode is sourced, and here is where it came from. Eleanor White's Organized Stalking. A Target's View, Chapter 6, held in the One Voice knowledge base as Document 765. The Church Committee's Final Report. The Declassified MKUltra Collection. Heinz Lehmann on Workplace Mobbing. Alan Fry in the Journal of Applied Physiology. The Justice Department's Stalking Victimization Report. Check every one of them. That is entirely the point of listing them. If the discipline in this episode is one you would rather practice than admire, there is a place built for it. TI One Voice lives at one.witisk.org. Every document graded by evidentiary weight, every claim labeled reported, contested, or established, every source cited so a skeptic can check it. And the community's live stream runs around the clock at meet.witisk.org. Under Public, TITV. You are welcome there. Next time on Knowledge Targeting Part 9, The Historical Roots, from COINTELPRO to Contemporary Organized Stalking. We have leaned on that program all episode as precedent. Next time we open the files themselves. The anonymous letters, the manufactured rumors, the quiet calls to employers and landlords, the reputations dismantled on paper, and how a single break-in at a small Pennsylvania office dragged all of it into the public record permanently and in the government's own words. Thank you for staying with a difficult episode. An episode about false information owes you more care than most, and we have tried to pay that debt. Naming what is established, marking what is only suspected, and saying out loud where the evidence runs out. If you take one habit away, take the question. Ask it of us. Ask it of our critics. Ask it gently of yourself before you share.